So it's my pleasure today to introduce Toby Levine, who many of you know. Toby grew up in the Bronx. She earned her bachelor's degree from Cornell, where she majored in child development and communications. She also earned a Master's of Education in Curriculum Design from Boston University. She worked at Synectics, right, the Children's Museum of Boston, Levine Research Associates, which she founded, WETA, which doesn't need any introduction here, and Toby Levine Communications, which she founded and led for 20 years. She retired after an exciting 42-year career and went on to exercise the other side of her brain by creating quilts, paintings, needlework, and fused glass items. She has lived in Cambridge, Brighton, Brookline, Potomac, Maryland, Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and Bonita Springs, Florida. So she's well versed in the United States. And today we're in for a special treat. She's going to tell us about her career, a lifetime learning experience. Toby, it's all yours.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for inviting me to talk today. And thank you to you and to Nancy for the great publicity. People have been stopping me in the hall all day, so I'm excited to see so many of you here. Just want to put out a warning that I tend to talk quickly and get faster as I go on, so if I'm running away with the story, just call out to slow down, and I'll be happy to try to do that. So I'm going to talk today about my career, which I call a lifelong learning experience. In the year and a half I've been at Newbridge, many of you have asked me what I did professionally. I generally answered that I worked in public broadcasting. This was only partially true. Inevitably, one of you would ask something like, "Did you like working at NPR?" But the truth is that in my 42-year career, I spent exactly 1 hour consulting at NPR. Most of my work involved PBS and CPB, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I recently Googled myself to find what the world thought I did for a living, and I was referred to as a communications executive, a curriculum developer, an educational media director, and an executive producer. Back in the day in public television, what I did was called outreach. Let me go back to the beginning. In February 1964, I was a new bride, and my husband Andy was a graduate student at MIT. In those days, that automatically qualified me for a job at the Institute. I became a secretary in what, if memory serves, was called the Artificial Intelligence Department. My boss, Murray Eden, was the youngest full professor at MIT at the time, and generally called me kiddo, as in, "Kiddo, can you come over here?" Most of the time I worked there, he was consulting in Geneva, and I got to spend a lot of time with his graduate students. I mentioned to one of them that for my senior paper at Cornell, where I did my undergraduate work, I had read a very interesting book called Synectics by William J.J. Gordon. I was planning on starting graduate school a few months later and was intrigued by the process he and his colleagues had developed. Its purpose was to invigorate the creative process using a series of metaphors that would make the familiar strange and make the strange familiar. In the final chapter, Gordon alluded to the possibility of many educational applications, although none were described. One of the graduate students in the department mentioned that Gordon lived in Cambridge and urged me to call him. I was a new college graduate, barely 20, and couldn't imagine picking up the phone and calling a published author. But my friend kept at me until I made the call. It changed my life. Not only did Bill Gordon teach me the Synectics process, when I started graduate school in curriculum design, he became my mentor for my thesis and helped me create my first published work, a series of Synectics exercises for use in schools. After a while, Bill led me to my next job at the Children's Museum of Boston, which at the time was headed by Michael Spock, Ben Spock's son. You may remember that it was in an old mansion in Jamaica Plain. My office was on the 3rd floor, had a fireplace and leaded glass windows. The museum had a grant from the U.S. Department of Education to create what they called matchboxes. Match stood for materials and activities for teachers and children. If you were teaching locally in the mid-60s, you may recall that the museum sent cartons of artifacts to schools for 2-week periods. It was up to the teacher to figure out how to fit them into the curriculum. The idea of the Matchbox Project was to create lessons for 2-week curriculum units using artifacts from the museum's collection. My Matchbox was eventually called Musical Shapes and Sounds. The artifacts, including a quarter-size violin and many PVC pipes from which horns could be created, was packed in a steel drum. As you have probably figured out, the idea of using artifacts from the collection was rather loosely interpreted. So what does all this have to do with public broadcasting? Call it career prep. I promise I'll make the connection. At some point in my museum tenure, I became pregnant and eventually took a few years off. Since my husband was now pursuing a PhD and money was scarce, I began typing theses for other graduate students. I got very adept at creating bibliographies from little scraps of paper. This too had nothing to do with communications or public broadcasting. Moving on, I soon went back to work at a company called Creative Studies, located on Quarry Road in Brookline. I worked part-time, was paid $4 an hour, and had a blast. The owner was Israeli and could only review budgets in Hebrew. Also, he was incapable of understanding jokes in English, particularly if they involved sarcasm. But he and his partner, both of whom had come from apt associates, were creative and good at getting business. We developed various forms of educational games, including simulations on major issues like drug use. At some social event, they met a man who worked for the Massachusetts Department of Education, at a department that created and distributed educational television programs to schools. Get ready, here comes the connection. They wanted us to create some games for teachers to use to follow up their television programs. I was hooked. I found that I had a facility to translate between television producers and teachers. Before long, I left Creative Studies and established a small consulting firm. One of my first clients was WETA, the public television station in Washington, D.C. A woman I knew was helping them develop a proposal for a television series that came to be called Music ... is. Note that it was originally called Music ... but that title had already been used, so we just moved the dots and added more title, like Music ... is melody, Music ... is harmony. My friend invited me to join the project as curriculum director. We had a great team. The host of the series was the conductor named Murray Sidlin, who at the time was the resident conductor of the National Symphony Orchestra at the Kennedy Center. The orchestra played one segment in each program to illustrate the concept. We had great fun putting together the scripts, which always included some silly jokes, and I laughed so much at team meetings that my mascara typically ran down my cheeks. I soon was asked to consult on another WETA proposal for a series on black music called From Jump Street. The U.S. Department of Education approved the proposal, but had numerous questions about the budget, principally a line item for my travel back and forth between Brookline and D.C. The government program officer basically said, "Tell Toby that if she wants the job, she has to move to D.C." Well, by this time, we had 2 children, a house, and 2 cars. Andy, my husband, had gotten his PhD and was working with Mark Weinberg, as it happens, at Draper Lab. WETA made me a very generous offer to create and lead an education department, in addition to serving as the curriculum director from Jump Street. A major life decision had to be made. It was 1978. The truth is that Andy hadn't been particularly happy with the work he was doing. He tended toward being a peacenik, and Draper was mostly doing defense work. So my dear and very brave husband quit his job, and we moved our family to Potomac, Maryland. He restarted his career there, and we never looked back. I loved working at WIDA for 5 of the 6 years I worked there. By the 6th year, I was pretty burned out and was working on projects and with people whom I didn't particularly enjoy. My last major work there was creating a proposal for a new primetime series called The Africans, A Triple Heritage, narrated by Dr. Ali Mazrui, a political science professor at the University of Michigan. The triple heritage, as described by Mazrui, results from 3 major influences: an indigenous heritage, European colonization, and Islam. My father's mantra was, never be afraid to leave a job. So I did. I was able to leave WIDA with a nice contract to work on this project through a new consulting company that I started. It was a great transition, not only to being my own boss again, but being able to build a team. Another public television project in which I became deeply involved was Eyes on the Prize, which many of you probably recall or have seen parts of. It was a groundbreaking series by the late great television producer Henry Hampton on the civil rights movement in the first half of the 1960s. Henry was an old friend, and he and PBS convinced me that a distance learning college course needed to be developed around the series. Today, and certainly during the pandemic, a multitude of courses are available via distant learning. At the time, however, it was a new idea. The programs would replace lectures and would be supplemented by coursework. The only problem was I had less than a year to produce and publish the course materials, the major part of which was a textbook of primary source readings, each introduced with a headnote by a scholar. These had to be identified, approved by scholars, copyright cleared, prepared into a manuscript, and published in time for the series debut. Somehow we got it done. Many years later, my husband, one of our daughters, and his sister and her husband took a civil rights tour through the South. Our bus had a VCR, so I took along my cache of Eyes on the Prize tapes, and en route played whichever program was relevant to the site we were about to visit. In 1993-94, I was deeply involved in another television project called Auschwitz Inside the Nazi State, which was a co-production of the BBC and KCET, the public television station in Los Angeles. Its release was planned to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the 1946 liberation of the concentration camp. One of the funders of this project was the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the head of CPB at the time was a guy named Dick Carlson. You may know his son, Tucker. I will tell you, however, that although Dick was certainly a conservative, he saved public broadcasting for 5 years by being cut to shreds by Congress. KCET was my client, and one of my tasks was to produce a CD-ROM based on the series that could be used in high schools and colleges. The series itself comprised 6-hour-long programs. It was clear from my early research that no schools would devote this much time to studying the Holocaust. Many school systems don't include it in their curriculum at all. If you talk to high school students today, you will find, sadly, that a large number of them had known absolutely nothing about the Shoah. My job was to create educational materials that were more flexible than the 6 one-hour programs and contained more historical background along with lesson plans. We selected a few 10-minute segments from each program, acquired rights to a series of primary source materials, and included maps and lesson plans. I had the good fortune on this project of working with several consultants from Facing History and Ourselves, which many of you know from their work in the local community. As you can imagine, this was a significantly emotional project. After many months of book research, I was ready to do photo research for the CD-ROM. I spent many hours online poring over the photos held at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. In truth, I could not spend more than an hour or 2 on this task on any given day. Looking at the images was simply too upsetting. And for my part of the project, I needed some photos that were more directly related to the television series. These were all archived at the BBC in London. So off I went to London and spent the better part of a week doing my research and meeting with the BBC team. This was not the only trip I was able to take in connection with my work on this project. Once the materials had been developed, it was time to get into the educational community to introduce the project to teachers and show them how they could use it effectively to enhance their curriculum. Every 2 years, Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem, holds an international educators conference. Andy and I had long planned a trip to Israel for that summer, so I applied to Yad Vashem, and my proposal to give a workshop at the 1995 conference was accepted. You may be asking, what did I actually do on these projects? Many of the tasks I will describe will seem, and by today's standards, were absolutely antediluvian. We didn't have an internet, there was no Zoom, and even email was in its infancy. These were some of my typical tasks. Write or at least contribute to the funding proposal. No money, no project. Assemble a committee of scholars who would review scripts and other project materials for accuracy. I also chaired scholar meetings and negotiated when necessary between the scholars and the producers. Secure endorsements from the national educational organizations that were the most pertinent to the project. For example, the National Council for Social Studies, the Science Teachers Association, and so forth. Advise the production team on how their project connected to school curricula. If there was no connection to local educational standards, teachers would not use the programs. Prepare and distribute educational materials to teachers. With no internet, we did a lot of printing and mailing. As you can imagine, it was very expensive and took a lot of time. Keep the educational community informed of the air date and what rights they had for taping and using the program in the classroom. Work with the videotape distributor, often designing the packaging. Prepare and conduct teacher workshops at PTV stations around the country to further promote the use of the programs by teachers. You may be asking yourself why government agencies and private foundations would pay for these activities when they probably had already invested $1 million or more to produce the programs. The answer is to create an ongoing life for the series. There was no streaming, and YouTube didn't yet exist. A major public television series would air once or twice and be gone. And regardless of how much time and effort had been spent on promotion, if there happened to be a national emergency on the air date, or maybe a championship ball game, it was likely that the viewing audience would be significantly reduced. By creating a secondary audience for the project, ongoing usage was assured. I'd like to briefly tell you about 3 other projects I was involved in that were very meaningful in my life. 2 of them, I call them my cradle-to-grave projects, were initiated and funded by the Commonwealth Fund in New York City. The first is called Healthy Steps, and it currently is in use in more than 200 pediatric practices around the country. The basic premise is that most children who see their pediatrician are basically healthy, at least physically. In a Healthy Steps practice, a child development specialist sits in on the examination, follows up with the family afterwards, making home visits if necessary, and attending to the mother's psychological issues when needed. I was invited to participate in the project by Alvin H. Perlmutter, a New York television producer with whom I had worked on several other projects. This particular project gave me the opportunity to use my background in child development, in which I had majored at Cornell. We worked with the pediatric team from the Boston Medical Center and produced and packaged 9 videos to introduce the concepts to pediatric practices nationwide. The training package was also used in medical schools and in internships. The second project in this, The second project in this group concerned nursing homes. It was called Everyone Wins: Quality Care Without Restraints. At the time the project was initiated, it was common practice for nursing home residents to be restrained in various ways, theoretically for their own protection. but the law changed and it was no longer legal to do this. The problem was the nurses had been trained to restrain patients. It wasn't that they were venal. In order to change their behavior, we first had to understand the culture and then communicate alternative behaviors. Once again, we produced a video training package to demonstrate these concepts. The final project I'm going to talk about is called the Guide to Math and Science Reform. It had no video and minimal print materials. At one point in the early 2000s, the National Science Foundation granted $5 million to each state to improve math and science education in K-12 schools. Each state was empowered to develop its own program. I was approached by the Annenberg CPB project, then housed at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, to create a searchable database of the many projects that were being developed around the country. The money came from Ambassador Walter Annenberg, who had originally given $150 million to CPB to develop television-based distance learning courses. I was well known at CPB and had worked on several of these courses. But one night, the Philadelphia PBS station aired a documentary that was critical of the ambassador, and he was always called the ambassador with a slight hitch of tone. He immediately pulled back on whatever was left of the $150 million. After considerable negotiation, the grant was reinstated, but redirected to serve elementary and high schools rather than college students. Like many of my projects, the technology changed markedly over the 6.5 years I developed the project. The first edition of the guide, as it was called, was distributed in a package of 6 small discs. I truly doubt that many people downloaded the data. By the end of the project, the database was entirely online and was updated several times a month. In closing, I want to return to my title, that mine was a career of lifetime learning. Each of the projects I worked on generally took 2 to 3 years to bring to fruition. I generally knew little about the subject matter when I started, but I learned from some of the finest scholars and was tasked with communicating my learning to teachers nationwide. It was a little like getting a new master's degree every few years. The bottom line is I've been pretty fortunate in my career. I got to work on many award-winning projects with world-class production teams and brilliant scholars. Each project generally took 2 to 3 years to complete and thus required a thoughtful commitment before signing on. I chose to retire after the Auschwitz project. I felt I had made my contribution to an important curriculum and was ready to start the next phase of my life. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about my lifelong learning career. If you have questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Any question or comment at all?
Judith.
I think people can hear me even if the mic isn't turned on. But thank you, Toby. That was really, really interesting. And just the dedication is to everybody's well-being through the projects that you took on. I'm kind of interested in the transition you made because, you talk about how you went from, this sort of intellectual pursuit and decimation of all of these dissemination of all of these wonderful projects and materials that are quite a legacy to a kind of artistic career. Did you, in the background, while you were so busy and so intense on these projects, did you kind of keep up your artistic side as well? Or were you only able to sort of focus, just required intense focus on it?
I had always done a lot of needle pointing. And when I was getting ready to retire, or I didn't retire when I closed my business, but just before I closed my people advised me that you had to retire to something. I never quite embraced that theory. I just hung it up and figured I'd figure it out as I went along. I mean, there were issues like all the years I was working, I never had time to have lunch with a friend. I mean, if I had lunch with somebody, it was definitely work-related. I lived down the street from a wonderful art center, and I had lived there for 10 years and had never taken a course. And I realized I had an opportunity that I was just, leaving on the floor. So I signed up for a course, for an art class. I took a quilting class. I mean, I really had no plan in mind, but I really wanted to start using the other side of my brain that I really hadn't had a chance, and to have friendships. I mean, when you're running a business, it's really hard to have 2 children and a husband and friendships as well. I mean, I certainly had friends, but the time to spend with them was minimal.
So, Toby, first of all, thank you for that incredible talk. And I want to just state that it is a model of how Residents Present should be. It was
Thank
short,
you.
to the point, and was riveting. So, anyway, so I hope that you will actually give us, in writing, where we can find the programs today. I would like to start watching some of them, and I presume they're on YouTube and other places, but it would be absolutely wonderful. And if you give it to me, I'll distribute it to the Newbridge community.
I'm glad you asked that question because, as you know, I'm a word person rather than the video person. I was never a producer, and I know little about video technology. All of my tapes, which are in formats that are no longer used, are locked in a basement closet in my daughter's house. So I didn't choose to try to work that through. Some of them are certainly located on YouTube. Some of them are located through what's now called learner.org, which is the current transformation of the Annenberg CPB project. The others you just have to Google. I mean, I'm happy to Google the ones that I spoke about and see if I can put together something. I mean, I worked on probably 100 different projects over 42 years, but the ones that I've mentioned, I'm happy to try to figure out how you could see them.
Right. I was thinking particularly of the Auschwitz one.
I believe that's available on YouTube, but I'll check it out. It's unfortunate that the producers, the American producers, which was KCT in Los Angeles, kind of changed its focus after the project and was just not that interested in the distribution of it, which is very sad because, a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of thought went into how it was produced. I probably have at least one copy of the CD-ROM, which I'm happy to share with people if they're interested and have a machine that could use it.
Or maybe we could get it digitized for you, and then it could be put on YouTube.
That would be fun. I mean, then you'd at least get to see some of the segments from the program.
Right, exactly.
Any other questions?
So you indicated that you didn't have a plan going forward, but you basically didn't have a plan on the individual projects. You got a project, and then you had to figure it out. So it's not surprising that you managed to succeed in your retirement in finding other paths.
Well, the best thing I did was to come here. That was my best plan. Bob wants to know why did I come here? I came here because I got tired of trying to take care of a big house and a big piece of property by myself. My children were here, and I was getting older and not so easy to get around anymore, and I said, I've got to do something different. Also, I had visited a friend who was in rehab here quite a number of years ago, and I was so impressed with what I saw, both in terms of the environment and the staff, that I immediately, when I had knee surgery about 3.5 years ago, I insisted on coming here for my rehab and immediately sent in my deposit. Actually, it's more like 5 years ago now, because I knew that this was the right environment for me after my husband was gone. Yeah.
Hold on, Bob.
How were you compensated? Was it all the same Were you paid in advance? Were you paid by segment? How did
Sometimes I was happy to be paid at all. No, there was a budget for the project, and I would have a contract with whoever my client was that would stipulate how I would be paid, usually on deliverables. Um, Public television, as you know, is a hard process in terms of money. And I mean, I certainly had several situations over the years where I was working with people that I really adored on projects that I adored, but getting paid for them was not so easy. I mean, eventually, I think there was only one client I had over the years that I never got paid from. But, you know, I'm sure it was a project that I believed in and, you know, chose to finish anyway. But it wasn't always easy to get that check. And because I was doing all the printing and mailing, you know, I sometimes had large expenses that really weren't going to me or my staff, that I had to carry for a while, and that could be, you know, certainly made some nights a little sleepless for me. But I have to say, I was very fortunate my husband went to work every day and brought home a check every 2 weeks, so I was able to take professional risks that didn't hurt our family.
So, Toby, since you've been here, I've had the pleasure to work with you a little bit, and I've discovered that your editing skills are superb. And I was wondering which of these careers that you've been involved in has brought you to this place and what you're doing here.
Well, over the years, I published a lot of materials with these various projects, and they all had to be edited and proofread and published. So I did a lot of editing over the years, and in those days, I was very careful. I called it real estate. If you had so much room on a page, that's all you could write. And if people wrote more than that, you had to cut it back. So I got very used to cutting out words, making sure things fit on the page.
Toby, did you have anything to do with Sesame Street?
Not a thing, ever.
Okay.
But I'll tell you a cute story. I mean, people thought I worked in children's television. I never worked in children's television. I had a young woman shadow me one day when I was at WETA, and she thought I worked in children's television. And at the end of the day, I said to her, as you would to, you know, any in a similar situation, so what did you learn, and do you have any questions? She said, well, I thought you worked in children's television. All you talked about was budget and contracts. I said, yes, that's the way television programs get produced. No budget, no contract.
Which one was your least favorite project?
Oh dear, I wouldn't want to embarrass any of my former clients.
Kind of interesting.
That's a good question. I mean, you know, over the years, over 42 years, I changed so much over the years that, I mean, I loved working on Music Is. We had so much fun. We were all young Turks at the time, and we just had a blast working together. So in a way, that was my favorite project, but there were some projects that I didn't enjoy at all, and some projects which I would do again today in a flash. But I have to turn off my watch because I don't know how to turn it off.
Oh, one more.
I lived in Montgomery County, in Maryland, in Potomac, from '84 to 2007. And I was a federal employee. I was curious to know if you were ever a federal employee during your work.
No.
Smart move.
No, actually, I was not a federal employee, and my husband was never a federal employee. He worked for what in Washington we called Beltway bandits. He was a mechanical engineer and you know, he worked for a lot of different engineering firms over the years.
Any more questions? No? All right. Thank you, Toby.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.